I would like to welcome you all to our second Lunch and Learn webinar from IACAPAP. And the topic of this webinar is childhood anxiety and parent-based treatment. And I'm extremely happy to welcome our speaker, which is Lebowitz. And Professor Lebowitz studies and treats children and adolescents anxiety at the Yale Child Study Center. His research focuses on the development, neurobiology, and treatment of anxiety and related disorders, with specific emphasis on family dynamics and the role of parents in these problems. Professor Lebowitz is the lead investigator on multiple funded research projects and the author of many research papers, books and chapters on childhood and adolescent anxiety, which I can highly recommend. He's also the father of 3 great boys, and we are very happy to listen to your talk, Dr. Lebowitz. And now my slide, here you can see him, but you will also see him in a second when I start to share my screen, and Dr. Lebowitz will share his.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, for the introduction, and it's an honor to be able to speak with you on this topic of child anxiety and parent-based treatments. I'm going to pull up some slides so we can follow along as we go through. All right, jumping right in, I don't have any special conflicts of interests to disclose for this talk. I do have some research funding and some royalties for books. Excuse me. So these are the main anxiety problems that we're usually talking about when we're talking about anxiety in youth, as well as in adults, really, because overall the presentation is in some ways quite similar. So we're talking about phobias, strong, irrational, exaggerated fears of just about anything, but certainly some things are a lot more likely to be the focus of a child's phobia. Common phobias can include things like the dark and heights and animals and bugs, and blood and needles. And I think the one note that I'd maybe make about the phobias is that even though their focus is technically narrow, and we call them specific phobias, the impairment to a child's life and their functioning and even family life can be a whole lot broader, because children will often avoid a very wide range of situations in which they fear they could come into contact with the focus of their phobia. So for example, a child with a phobia of dogs might not avoid only an actual dog, but even situations where they think there could be a dog. And that of course includes a huge range of different situations. So the impairment can really be quite broad. Panic disorder is characterized by recurring panic attacks, which are a little bit like having a wire trip in your brain and just being awash in these tremendous waves of anxiety, both physical and psychological. And even though the panic attack itself is not particularly dangerous for a healthy child, it is intensely uncomfortable and distressing. And the impairment in panic disorder really relates to the fear and the worry of having additional panic attacks. And that can lead to a lot of safety behaviors and to a lot of avoidance and to overall impairment. And closely linked to panic disorder is agoraphobia, which is the avoidance of situations because of the fear of having some physical symptoms, like panic symptoms, and not being able to easily escape that situation, or perhaps being humiliated in front of others because of the symptoms. This is a big contributor, for example, to school refusal, because children may become worried that they'll have panic symptoms in school and then avoid going to school because other children would notice if they have those symptoms, or they can't just get up and leave. Generalized anxiety is really chronic, interfering, and persistent worry. Could be worry about anything. Often the content will change. Typical worries can include things like health, financials, issues, the future, mistakes they might have made, perfectionism. So it's a little bit like having an antenna that's tuned to pick up things to worry about, and then your mind just churns away with these worries, often keeping you up at night, not letting you relax. and it leads to a lot of exhaustion, both physical and mental. Children with generalized anxiety will often develop physical symptoms like aches and pains, fatigue, lack of or difficulties with attention. Their immune system gets run down, so they get sick more easily. And so this can be a very big problem as well. Social anxiety is an excessive preoccupation with the social evaluation of other people and the fear of being negatively evaluated. And so even though children with social anxiety may wish they had friends and want to have friends that they feel comfortable with, they'll often avoid most social situations because of the fear that it'll go wrong, that they'll mess up, that people will think they're silly or stupid. And so they'll often end up being quite isolated and lonely. Separation anxiety is the fear of being separated from attachment figures. Parents typically, children might worry about something that will happen to them when the parent is away, like getting lost or being kidnapped. Children might also worry about something that will happen to the parent when the parent is away, like getting in a car accident or not coming home, things like that. And so we can have a lot of impairment both for the child, but also for the family, who will often not be able to leave a child alone, sometimes even for very short periods of time, like not being able to sleep away from the child or not being able to close a door even in the house because the child needs to be able to see them. And obsessive compulsive disorder, as I'm sure you know, is some combination of obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and compulsive behaviors. These are usually rigidly scripted, ritualized behaviors that the child has to perform in order to reduce the distress relating to their thoughts. Now, anxiety disorders typically have their onset in childhood. Even when first diagnosed in adults, typically an anxiety disorder will have onset in childhood with a median age of onset of around age 10 or 11. So quite early in life. And here you can see some of the age ranges for the onset of these common problems. So in younger children, we'll often see specific phobias and separation anxiety. As we get more into the puberty years, we'll see more generalized anxiety. And then through adolescence, social anxiety, and later in adolescence, panic disorder. And obsessive compulsive disorder really has these two peaks in terms of onset. One is more early, around age 6-ish, and then another peak of onset for OCD is a little bit later in adolescence. And an important thing to note is just the overall prevalence, which is really staggering. Current estimates place the lifetime prevalence for childhood anxiety at around 1 in 3. So meaning about 1 in 3 children will have a clinical anxiety disorder at some point before they reach adulthood. And as we said, the median age of onset overall is really quite young. And another important note about anxiety disorders is just how comorbid they are with other problems. So there's tremendous comorbidity within the anxiety disorders. In fact, most children presenting with one clinical anxiety disorder will actually meet criteria for at least one more anxiety disorder. And it's less common to see a child with only one, but there's also a lot of comorbidity with other problems. And so many children with anxiety will also develop depression. A lot will also develop symptoms of ADHD, and a lot will develop problems relating to substance use or abuse. And some of that is what you might think of as a form of self-medication. Self-medication, as children discover that smoking something or drinking something can help to alleviate that voice in their mind that's always making them feel anxious and worried, and they feel better, they may seek out that experience again. And this can set in motion a cascade or a spiral of events that will lead to some serious substance-related problems. And before we talk about treatment, I guess one other point that I wanted to make is just around the heterogeneity of the phenotype for anxiety, just how differently these problems can present in different children. So, if you close your eyes and imagine what an anxious child looks like, you may be imagining a child who looks really scared. Maybe they avoid eye contact, they look away, they're cowering in a corner. And that is going to be true for some children with anxiety. But in other children, it's going to present quite differently. For some children, it will look more like rigidity or perfectionism, or in some children, it might actually look like oppositionality or even anger-related issues, behavior and externalizing symptoms. I always say to parents and to others that everybody knows the phrase fight or flight, but very often we forget that half of that is fight, meaning that anxiety can prime us for flight through feelings of fear, but it can also prime us for fight through feelings of anger, irritability, rage, and hostility. And so it's important to remember that when we see a child who's showing symptoms that are more externalizing, one possible explanation is actually anxiety related, and that's sometimes less obvious to parents, to teachers, and even to mental health providers. Now, over the past decades, as you may well know, there have been really mainly two evidence-based, very well supported through research treatments for anxiety in youth. On the psychological side, that has included cognitive behavioral therapy, and on the pharmacological side has included primarily treatment with SSRIs. And there is a lot of research supporting the efficacy of both of these treatments. There are many, many randomized controlled trials, and they do show good efficacy. And I think that a reasonable conservative read of all of that data suggests that approximately half, maybe up to even a little bit more than half of children who receive one or both of these evidence-based treatments is likely to have a really good response, meaning they'll either have full remission and will no longer have an anxiety disorder, or they may have partial remission or just really good response so that their function is very much improved and the distress is reduced and the impairment is reduced. And that is very good news, given how common these problems are. Being able to effectively treat half is really very good news. However, it also does leave half of the children without a good enough solution. And so we are still very much in need of additional treatments. And one thing that a lot of people have thought about over the years is the role of parents and how to best involve parents in the treatment of anxiety in youth. There have been a lot of clinical studies that tried to enhance the outcomes of cognitive behavioral therapy in children by also working with parents. And overall, most of those studies have not been very successful, meaning that children who got CBT only and children who got CBT plus some parent work didn't really have very different outcomes. And that is somewhat frustrating because we were trying to improve these outcomes, and so doing more work we would hope would lead to better results, but it really hasn't. And so it raises some important questions. And I think maybe the most important question is, what should we be doing with the parents of anxious children? Now, most of those studies, almost all of them, the way that they tried to involve parents in the treatment of child anxiety is by training parents as what is often called a lay CBT therapist, meaning that you're teaching the parents the tools of CBT, the same kind of tools that a therapist would be using with the child in their direct child-based treatment. So, for example, teaching the parents about cognitive biases and thinking traps and cognitive restructuring so that they can practice that with the child. Or teaching the parents about physical regulation skills like breathing and muscle relaxation so that they can practice that with the child. And teaching them about exposures so that they can practice graded exposures with their child. Now, that makes sense, but has not proven to be very effective. And so I think a really important question is, what else could we be doing? And I think there's actually a really good answer to that question as well, in terms of what else should we be doing. And I want to set the stage for what I'm going to try to suggest to you as an answer for what we should be doing with parents. I want to try to set the stage for that through this slide that I put together that has a lot of pictures on it. And the pictures are really sweet and cute, but they're not a random collection of cute pictures. There is a theme to the slide and a point that it's trying to make. And the theme is that these are all pictures of mammals. And in fact, they're all pictures of mommy-child mammal pairs. And the point that the slide is making is that we, human beings, fit into this group because we're also mammals, and that our mammalian nature actually has some really deep implications for understanding child anxiety and for understanding how it differs from adult anxiety and for understanding the role of parents and how we can work with them. Now, why does it matter that we are mammals? It matters because mammals are born not very well prepared for life. We're born defenseless, unable to feed ourselves, unable to protect ourselves, and we rely on our caregivers to help us to deal with threats. A young mammal who experiences threat, danger, fear, or anxiety, their response is meaningfully different from the response of an adult mammal who experiences fear. If you were to scare an adult human being, they would have a typical fight or flight response, right? Like if you walk up to somebody and scare them, they may confront you or they may try to get away from you. And that's a typical adult version of the fight or flight response. In children, however, things are different. If you walk up to a baby and you scare them, they can't confront you and they also can't really run away. So what do? They signal their caregiver. Right? They respond with an attachment behavior that's oriented toward a caregiver. Typically in a baby, that's going to be crying. And as the child gets older, it's going to look a little bit like clinging, hiding behind the parent, or seeking help and reassurance from the parent. This point was made wonderfully in an experiment that you may be familiar with. This is a very famous experiment that Harry Harlow did many, many years ago in Wisconsin when he studied attachment in monkeys. And he took baby monkeys and he raised them in a cage with a fake mother, like a doll mother, and he scared the baby to see the response. You can see, I'm going to play a little video of this, and you can see it for yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Now, in this experiment, this is the apparatus we use. That looks diabolical. That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it. Flashing eyes, loud sounds, moving mechanical parts, all of these things are designed to frighten a monkey. Now here we have a peaceful, resting baby monkey. Let's find out what his reactions to his mother are when we frighten him. He's scared, all right, and he does what any child will do in a similar situation. He runs away. It's more than running away. He was running to his mother, to touch her, to drive away his fear. Contact with the mother changes his entire personality. Look, now he's actually threatening the diabolical object. All right. This gives us part of the picture of the strength of infantile love.
I think you can see it very strongly in a video like that. That's the child version, essentially, of the fear response, which is to signal the caregiver and look to them for protection. And Harlow ended that clip by saying it gives us part of the picture. I agree, it only gives us part of, his experiment only gives us part of the picture because he had not a real mother in the cage, but a doll, essentially. And a doll can't respond back to the child. But in real life, when a child is scared and they signal their caregiver that they are experiencing fear, the mother doesn't sit there frozen like a doll. The mother is going to respond back. Children are hardwired to respond to their caregivers through these interpersonal behaviors, and caregivers are hardwired to detect the cues of fear in their children and to respond back in turn by providing protection and by providing reassurance and regulation and soothing. And what that means is that fear in young people is really an interpersonal phenomenon that deeply involves both the child and the parent. And if a child has a disorder where the core of the disorder is chronic and inappropriate activation of the threat detection system, what's going to result is activation of that interpersonal system for signaling the fear to the parent and for the parent to respond to it through protection and regulation, meaning that anxiety in children really is inherently interpersonal. And we see this when we see families where there is an anxious child, we see how deeply involved parents become in their children's symptoms through the process of accommodation, meaning accommodation, what it means really is all of the changes that parents make to their own behaviors to help a child avoid or alleviate the distress relating to their disorder. So for example, if a child has separation anxiety, the parent may accommodate by staying with the child. Or if a child has generalized anxiety, the parent may accommodate by responding to their worried questions and providing endless reassurance. Or if a child has OCD, the parent may participate in their obsessive compulsive symptoms. And this kind of accommodation is almost universally present when there is a child with anxiety. Almost every parent around the world, this has been studied not just in America, but also in the Middle East and in many countries in Asia and in many countries in Europe and in Australia, et cetera. And wherever we look, somewhere around 97 to 100% of parents who have an anxious child report that they engage in that kind of accommodation. And it's not just that the accommodation is present, but we also know it's a problem. Because even though it's well-intentioned and parents are doing the accommodation to try to help their child be less anxious, and also to get through the day because they have to get the child to sleep and to school and they have to get to work. Even though it's well-intentioned and it's trying to be helpful, a lot of research demonstrates that as parents accommodate more, the child actually tends to become more anxious over time. So higher levels of accommodation are linked to more severe anxiety and to more impairment functionally for the child as well as for the rest of the family. And high levels of accommodation predict poor treatment outcomes, both for cognitive behavioral therapy and also for medications. So we know that it's a very big part of the problem. And we've also been studying it neurologically to understand some of the infrastructure, for example, using brain imaging. In an example of this, we've taken large samples of children with anxiety and put them in a brain scanner and shown them images where some of those images are designed to trigger some fear. And we know that anxious children are going to show response in fear circuitry. But in our lab, what we do is scan each child twice. Once when the parent is there and once when they're not there. And what we see is that when the parent is there holding the child's hand, there is less reactivity and there's better ability neurologically for the child to regulate their own fear. And when we look at just how big of an impact the parent had on the child's brain response, what we see is that the parent who had the biggest impact on the child's brain response is also the parent who's reporting the most accommodation on the family accommodation scale, which is just a clinical indicator or measure of how much accommodation. And so we see the biological infrastructure that is driving these patterns of entanglement between parent and child. Now, what we have done is to take these insights essentially into the interpersonal component of child anxiety and the role of family accommodation and to translate them into a parent-based treatment for child anxiety. And we call that treatment SPACE. SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And it is an entirely parent-based treatment. So unlike cognitive behavioral therapy, and even unlike medication that requires direct participation on the child's side, because if you're doing CBT, the child has to have motivation to come in and do the work of cognitive behavioral therapy. And even for medication, the child has to be swallowing the medicine. In SPACE, the treatment works entirely through changing the parent's behavior. So it's not like training the parent to do CBT to the child. They're not going home to make their child do something or to stop the child from doing something. Rather, we're focusing on those critically important responses of the parent themselves to their child's anxiety and their distress. And what we teach parents to do is to make two important changes in the way that they are responding to their anxious child. The first of those changes is to become more supportive, to increase supportive responses. And I'm going to share with you exactly what we mean by a supportive parental response. The other change in the parents is to detect, monitor, and systematically reduce the accommodations of the child's anxiety symptoms. So to gradually, but systematically reduce those family accommodations. So I said the first of the changes is to increase support. And here's what we mean by a supportive response to an anxious child. We would say a parent is being supportive in response to their anxious child when the parent is able to show the child two messages through their words and also through their actions. The first of those messages is a message of acceptance, meaning validating what the child is genuinely experiencing, the distress that they are experiencing. This can be really simple. It can be something like saying to a child, I get it, you are anxious. It doesn't mean that I am, but I get it, you're anxious, or this is hard for you, or this scares you. So the first part of the supportive message is simply accepting, validating, and acknowledging the child's experience. The second part of the supportive message is a message of confidence, meaning communicating to the child that I, the parent, believe that you can handle that experience of anxiety, that you can survive it, you can cope with it, tolerate it, and still be okay in the end. Now, when you put those two together, acceptance and confidence, it might sound a little bit like, sorry, let me go up a slide. It might sound a little bit like saying something like, I see it's hard for you, and I'm sure that you can handle it. And what we know from a lot of research and also clinical experience is that neither one of those two ingredients of support is necessarily intuitive or all that common in the way that parents are, in fact, responding to their anxious children. Sometimes the acceptance isn't there. For example, a parent might be dismissive of the child's experience. Sometimes in mild ways, like a child says something is scary and the parent says, no, it isn't. And sometimes in harsher ways, like when a child is scared and the parent says things like, don't be a baby, grow up, don't be a wuss, things like that. The confidence piece is also not always there. In fact, many anxious children are going to grow up explicitly hearing themselves described as a child who cannot handle anxiety. Parents will say things like, my kid can't cope with anxiety, or they can't deal with stress. And if you think about it from the child's perspective, if the message you're continually hearing about yourself is that you can't handle anxiety, then what are you going to believe? Probably that you can't handle it. And that's going to make you more anxious, more avoidant, and ultimately more anxious. And so we work in a systematic way in space with parents on practicing these supportive statements and helping them to practice making them to the child frequently. And then on this next slide, you can see a breakdown of the treatment steps in a little bit more detail. You can see that we start with a little bit of an introduction to the treatment, where we will introduce parents to the rationale. We will explain the basic components of the treatment. We'll address concerns that they might have. And then we'll work on increasing those supportive responses in the way that I was describing, but in a really kind of practical and systematic way. And then we'll spend time charting out all the different accommodations that parents have been making, and often there are many of them, but we will choose one particular target, a focus for accommodation reduction, and we'll make really clear, detailed plans with parents for how they will change that behavior and reduce the accommodation, and also for how they're going to let the child know about the plan in advance so we're not taking them by surprise. And then they'll be implementing those plans and eventually reducing another accommodation after that. And SPACE also includes a set of tools to help parents cope with the children's responses. Because not surprisingly, when parents start reducing the accommodation, sometimes children respond with some challenging reactions. For example, becoming upset or more anxious in the short term, or even angry, or saying to the parent, you don't care about me anymore. And these can be very hard for parents. And so there's a set of tools to help parents to cope with those and be able to continue pursuing the treatment in a systematic and successful way. Because it turns out that when parents are able to make those two changes of being more supportive and less accommodating, and to do it systematically, children can overcome even serious anxiety disorders, and even without meeting directly with a therapist themselves. We've done a lot of research on this. There are multiple clinical trials, but I wanted to share just a tiny bit of information from one of those trials. And this was a study, a fairly large study, with over 120 children with primary severe anxiety disorders, who were allocated randomly to either receive cognitive behavioral therapy, where the child met directly with a therapist for CBT, or they were randomly assigned to SPACE, where the child never met with a therapist at all, and only the parent met with the therapist to do SPACE. And following treatment, children who received SPACE were as likely as children who received CBT to be either in full remission or to have very good response to treatment, meaning being very significantly improved in terms of their symptoms and impairment. And we saw this on our secondary outcomes as well, on measures that were completed not only by the clinical evaluator who was blind to the treatment condition, or by the parent even, but even by the child themselves, which is really remarkable, because remember that we're now comparing ratings that were completed by a child who actually had 12 sessions with a therapist, and we're comparing that to ratings of children who never met with a therapist, but we had complete non-inferiority, or essentially equivalence in outcomes for SPACE and for CBT, which is really terrific. And when we, in another clinical trial, we actually used the brain imaging procedure that I described very briefly a few minutes ago, with scanning the child's brain when the child is alone and when the mother is there. And following SPACE, the difference between the two conditions shrank. It was much, much smaller. So essentially, children were able, following SPACE, to better regulate their own fear independently at the neurological level. So we're actually seeing brain changes in a child following a completely parent-based treatment, and those align with the clinical outcomes that we see in terms of diagnoses and rating scales, et cetera. So I know I've pretty much used up my time, but I wanted to share this resource for parents, or sorry, for people who want to learn more about this treatment, because there's only so much we can do in 30 minutes. You should visit the website, which is spacetreatment.net. And on that website, there are many, many resources, including a lot of articles and videos and podcasts, but also information on training for people who want to be trained in SPACE so that they can provide it in their own work. And there's a Facebook page, et cetera. And these are some books relating to this treatment as well. The one on the left I'll highlight is the one in blue, is a book that's actually I wrote for parents to be able to implement this treatment on their own, but it actually, I think, is a really good resource for therapists as well. And the other two books are written more for the therapist. So I have used up my allotted time, so I'm going to stop there and say thank you to all of you, and I'm happy to answer questions if there were some questions along the way, or if there are now. I'm going to stop the screen share at that point.
Ida, thank you so much for this interesting and very, very inspiring talk. I think I have learned a lot, and yeah, I really like the decent way you get to the problem, yeah, and also the realistic way you show up the research results of what we tried before, and what it means to use SPACE. But now I'm coming to a question that we have in the Q&A session, which is how anxiety disorders and attachment or other developmental theories are connected.
Yeah, this is a deep question that is hard to give a short answer to. You know, it's very hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, at one level, I'm talking about attachment, right? Because when we talk about the child's response to fear being directed for the parent, that is part of the attachment system, which is, you know, part of how children respond to fear. But we also know that insecure attachment can be related to anxiety in children who have not formed a really strong kind of secure attachment that enables them to explore the world feeling safe, etc., can actually be linked to higher rates of anxiety and to higher rates of anxiety disorders in children. And you know, the DSM or the ICD, they don't really go into that sort of underlying level of etiology and why children have these problems. When we're diagnosing, we're really focused more on the symptom level, and we're saying, okay, here's a child with anxiety, but we're not always really giving a deep understanding of why this child might have that problem, why this child and not another one. And we know that the etiology of anxiety can be really complex, including both innate biological, including genetic and non-genetic factors, and also very much impacted by environmental factors, experiences, including within that also those experiences that shape the attachment of the child. So I'm not able to give a short answer to the link between attachment and anxiety, but I think it's a really deep question that warrants a lot more work than we've been able to do so far.
And there's another question from Mr. Cook. He asked for work about self-regulation, like emotional or sensory self-regulation and anxiety. So
I'm trying to make sure that I understand the question. Work on self-regulation in anxiety. So, I mean, in a sense, any anxiety disorder, one way to think about it could be to think about it as like a dysregulated system, and at one level, a kind of failure of regulation, right? Because we're all going to be experiencing anxiety triggers at different points, but an anxious child is not only a child who is going to be experiencing more triggers, although that is likely to be true, but they're also going to be a child who is not doing as well at self-regulating, so that when you have a trigger elevating your anxiety, you're able to sort of return to a state of calm. And that leads to a lot of problems, because the child who has more difficulty regulating is also going to be the child who's more committed and more motivated not to experience the trigger in the first place. And so you then have a lot of avoidance stemming from that. And you know, when we work directly with children, what we're often trying to do is to teach them regulation skills. Those can be cognitive skills, things you can do in your mind. They can be physical skills you can do in your body, emotion-based skills for regulation, as well as other behavioral things. When we're doing space, in a sense, what we're saying is the child has the capacity for self-regulation, but it's hard. And so that child is relying on the parent to do the work of regulation for them. And that works in the short term, but ends up being a trap that leaves them sort of locked into the anxiety over time. And in space, in a sense, what parents are doing is to say to the child, like, I believe in your ability to regulate, even though it will be harder, but I need you to believe in that too. And I need to build that confidence in the child. It's a little bit like if you have a child with weaker muscle tone and it's harder for them to get up and walk, the solution is not to always pick them up and carry them. The solution is to let them work through that so that they build up those muscles. And that is a little bit similar to the way that we're thinking about it in space. Now, even, and this, I guess I'll end this answer on this, even when we're doing space, we're doing parent-based work, there can still be room for teaching a child self-regulation skills as well, if they are open to learning them, right? If, whether that's through the parent or whether that's done by a therapist directly with the child, it can still be very beneficial to be teaching that child self-regulation skills. However, not every child is open to actually learning and practicing that. And because of that, it's really good to also have a treatment that can work even when you are not doing that, even when you're only working with the parents.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. We have two more questions. One question is from Ms. Mana. When the pharmacology or pharmacological treatment becomes necessary in the process of an anxiety treatment?
Yes, well, of course, this should always be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, right? And there really is no way to give like one rule that it's going to apply for everybody. It should be applied on a case-by-case basis. And the younger the child is, I think the more conservative and careful we should be about introducing medications. However, let me make I guess a couple of points. One is with more severe anxiety, right? The more severe the anxiety is, there is evidence and data to suggest that the more severe the anxiety is, the less likely it is to respond only to a psychological treatment without medication. Now, that doesn't mean that if the case is severe, you should immediately use medication, but it does mean that if the case is more severe and you're trying a psychological treatment, an evidence-based treatment, and it's not yielding good results, you may be open to thinking about the medication sooner rather than later. The other point to make is, I think most researchers would agree with what I'm about to say, which is that even when you are using a medication, there should also be an evidence-based psychological treatment as well. And so even if you are using medication, if the child is willing to do CBT, that would still be good to do alongside it. We're working with the parents like we do in space, doing that alongside the medication. And there's evidence to suggest that doing both of those is better than doing only the medication.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have two more questions, Ellie, and both are so interesting that I would like to ask them, even though we are running out of time. The first one is, and first of all, everybody is thanking you for the amazing presentation. Could you please tell us a bit more about how you implement space in terms of number and length of sessions with parents? Have you provided it online or in person?
Yes, excellent question. So typically, a typical course of space will be somewhere around 12 sessions, plus minus 1 or 2 sessions. That's the most typical. Some cases will be shorter and some might need to be longer, but that would be a typical course, would be, let's say, 12 weekly sessions of 1 hour each week. In our clinical trials, that's usually what we do, is 1 hour a week for 12 weeks. In terms of online and in person, we do a lot of this online. Even before the COVID pandemic, we were doing a lot of this work online with parents, like over Zoom or a similar platform. And of course, with COVID, even more of that. And one thing that I will say about space is that it is a treatment that lends itself very well to that kind of online work, because it's an adult therapist and you're talking to adult parents, and that makes it easier to do it over Zoom, relative to doing something like play therapy or even cognitive behavioral therapy with a child is more challenging to do over Zoom, and it works really well. In our data, we have not seen a significant difference between doing it tele or in person, and so I feel confident saying it can be over online.
Perfect. And now the last question, do you think that if parents could not afford for paying individual CBT for their child, this treatment itself could provide a good response itself? I find that question very, very interesting, because many of our members live in countries with low resources, and it is also very important to keep that in mind. So I think this question is brilliant.
It really is such an important thing, and access to care is such a huge roadblock and obstacle for so many children. And it really is unfortunate how many children will wait so long before they're able to get any kind of treatment. And that length of, from the onset of the problem until they're actually getting any kind of help is measured in months, sometimes years. It's a huge roadblock. Now, I don't know whether getting space is going to be easier financially than getting cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's possible that, I don't, maybe if you can't get one, it will also be challenging to get the other. I will say that we have done groups of space, and sometimes that makes it easier in terms of the financials, and doing it online also can make it easier because you cut out some of the costs by doing it that way. However, in terms of the actual question, do I think that doing only space with parents can be effective? Well, yes, I do think it. And the reason I think it is that is what the evidence suggests. That's what the clinical trials and the data suggest. And in our clinical trials, we're doing only one of the 2 treatments. That's one or the other. We're not doing both, although I hope to be able to do a study where we're doing combined treatment as well. Maybe that would be even better. But yes, in our clinical trials, doing only space with parents has proven to be an effective treatment for anxiety in kids.
Perfect. There are many more questions, but I'm afraid we are running out of time, and I would like to thank you again so much, Ellie, for that interesting and very inspiring presentation. And I would like to share my screen for a second to raise the attention of the audience to our third it's not a lunch and learn, actually, it's a brain and breakfast webinar, and it will be held on the 11th of January on the topic, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child, a community approach to assessment and intervention of mental health disorders in children and adolescents. And the talk will be given by Ms. Wong and Ms. Lin from Singapore. And we would be very happy to welcome you for this webinar again. And I would also like to encourage all of you to become individual members of IACAPAP. You will find more information on our website. And this is also a chance to directly receive our newsletters, information about activities like these Lunch and Learn webinars, but many more. And finally, I would like to raise your attention to our next international conference, which will be held in Dubai in 2022, from the 5th to the 9th of December. And we are very much looking forward to be together, hopefully live and in real life, but it will also be the option to join us through the internet. Yeah, thank you very much for your time and your interest in our webinar. And I say goodbye, good morning, good night, wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Eli. It was really brilliant.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was great to be able to do it. I tried to squeeze a lot into 30 minutes, so hopefully it wasn't too rushed.
I know. No, it was not at all. It's so good to, it's so easy to listen to you. There are some speakers where it's more difficult, but I really like to listen to you, how you give your talks. And I find the space program brilliant. Yeah, it's so important. And it also have these two components, like making the child feeling comfortable, or not comfortable in its anxiety, but really to validate it, which I think is very important and very difficult for many parents, but also to encourage it. Do you have information about moderators, like anxious parents themselves? Or anxiety disorders in parents themselves? Is it a moderator for the treatment outcome in space, or doesn't it have any info?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Now I get it. I didn't understand. I was thinking like different kind of moderator. So we're looking at moderators in the study. We're analyzing that data, actually. We published one study on moderators, and it was, we looked at like a whole lot of variables using this kind of machine learning approach, and there was some that came out. Some of them actually kind of, yes, parent related, like parent negativity or things like that, but some also biological things. Like oxytocin levels were a moderator of response.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you're
interested.
Just again
a link to the bonding.
Yeah, exactly.
And attachment.
Exactly. If you like, I can send you that paper. It's
yeah, I would love to. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, great. Thanks again for having me on.
Great. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Sue, for the great organization. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sue. Take
care.
Bye.
Yes, you too. Bye.